The sun hung merciless in the cloudless sky, a burning eye that watched over the parched lands of West Texas. Jake Sullivan pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare that bounced off the bleached rocks and sandy earth. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, picked her way carefully down the rocky slope toward the river below. The Rio Grande was running low this year, reduced to a muddy trickle between banks that should have been rushing with spring melt. Jake had been riding since dawn, following the river's course north from his small ranch. It was a journey he made every few weeks, checking the water levels and hunting for strays that might have wandered too far from his modest herd. The isolation suited him fine. After 35 years on this earth, most of them hard ones, he'd learned that solitude was often preferable to the complications that came with people. The wind kicked up, sending dust devils spinning across the barren landscape. Belle snorted and shook her head, eager to reach the water despite its sorry state. Jake patted her neck, feeling the sweat beneath his palm. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "We're almost there." As they descended the final stretch to the riverbank, Jake noticed how the drought had exposed rocks and roots that normally lay hidden beneath flowing water. The sight troubled him. Without reliable water, this land would become uninhabitable, even for someone as stubborn as himself. He'd seen it happen before. Good ranches turned to dust, families forced to pack up and head east or west, searching for something better. He dismounted at the river's edge, his boots crunching on the dried mud. Belle immediately lowered her head to drink while Jake pulled his canteen from his saddlebag. The water was murky but cool, and he filled the container carefully, trying not to stir up too much sediment from the bottom. That's when he heard it, a rustling in the thorny mesquite bushes that grew thick along the riverbank. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip. Out here, unexpected sounds usually meant trouble. Could be a mountain cat, though they rarely came down this far in daylight. Could be banditos from across the border, or even Apache raiders, though their numbers had dwindled in recent years. He stood slowly, water dripping from his canteen, eyes scanning the dense brush. Belle's ears pricked forward, and she raised her head, water streaming from her muzzle. Whatever was in those bushes, she'd sensed it too. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down his share of dangers. "Show yourself." The rustling stopped. For a long moment, only the whisper of wind through the canyon and the gentle gurgle of the river filled the silence. Then, like a ghost materializing from shadow, a figure emerged from the thicket. It was a woman, and the sight of her made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Her dress, once fine blue calico, was torn in several places, revealing scratches on her arms from thorns and rough travel. Her dark hair, which might have been pinned up properly once, now hung in tangled strands around her face. But it was her eyes that struck him most, wide, haunted, the color of sage honey, darting between him and the path behind her as if expecting pursuit at any moment. She couldn't have been more than 25. Jake reckoned, though fear and exhaustion had drawn lines on her face that made her seem older. She swayed on her feet, one hand gripping a mesquite branch for support, the other pressed against her ribs as if holding in some pain. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was hoarse, like she'd been running or crying or both. "Please, mister, I don't mean any harm." Jake kept his hand near his gun but didn't draw. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you're a long way from anywhere. What are you doing out here?" She glanced over her shoulder again, and Jake saw her entire body tremble. When she looked back at him, tears had begun to track through the dust on her cheeks. She took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough that he could see the desperation etched in every line of her face. "They'll kill me if you don't help," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Please, I know I've no right to ask, but I've been running for 2 days and I can't go any further." Jake felt something twist in his chest, an old instinct he'd thought long buried. He'd made a practice of minding his own business, of riding wide around other folks' troubles. It was safer that way, cleaner. But standing there in the harsh light of midday, looking at this woman who seemed about to collapse where she stood, he found himself wavering. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice gruff. She shook her head frantically. "There's no time. They can't be more than an hour behind me. Maybe less. Please, mister, I'm begging you." Jake studied her for a long moment. Every cautious bone in his body told him to mount up and ride away, to leave her to whatever fate was chasing her through this unforgiving land. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's problems rarely ended well. The scar across his left shoulder blade was a permanent reminder of the last time he'd played the hero. But there was something in her eyes, something beyond the fear, a flicker of steel. Maybe, or just the kind of desperate courage that comes when all other options have run out. And despite himself, despite all his hard-won wisdom about keeping clear of complications, Jake found himself nodding. "Can you ride?" he asked. Relief flooded her face, and for a moment he thought she might faint. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I can ride." Jake moved to help her, catching her elbow as she stumbled. Up close, he could smell the dust and sweat of hard travel on her, mixed with something faintly floral, lavender water, maybe, from whatever life she'd fled. She was lighter than he expected, as if fear had burned away everything but will and bone. "Belle can carry us both for a while," he said, leading her to his horse. "But not fast and not far. Where were you trying to get to?" "Anywhere," she said, accepting his help to mount. "Anywhere they can't find me." Jake swung up behind her, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She tensed at the closeness, then seemed to force herself to relax. He could feel her trembling. Whether from exhaustion or fear, he couldn't tell. "There's rough country to the north," he said, gathering Belle's reins. "Hard tracking through those canyons. If someone's following you, we might lose them there." She nodded, her tangled hair brushing his chin. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know what I'm asking. I know the danger. Save your breath." Jake cut her off, not unkindly. He turned Belle away from the river, urging her up a different path than the one he'd come down. "We'll have plenty of time for explanations if we make it through the day." As they climbed away from the Rio Grande, Jake cast one last look back at the peaceful scene they were leaving. The lazy river, the familiar trail, the simple plan of checking water and heading home, all of it vanishing now, replaced by the unknown dangers that came with the woman in his arms. The smart thing would have been to leave her there. Jake knew it. And part of him, the part that had survived this long by being careful, by keeping to himself, screamed at him for his foolishness. But it was too late now. He'd made his choice, thrown his lot in with whatever trouble was dogging her heels. The wind picked up again, hot and dry, carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain that would probably never reach them. Somewhere behind them, perhaps closer than he wanted to think about, rode men who meant to kill the woman now sharing his saddle. Jake touched his heels to Belle's flanks, urging her to a quicker pace despite the burden of two riders. Whatever came next, he reflected grimly. His quiet life by the river was over. The woman's desperate words echoed in his mind. "They'll kill me if you don't help." Well, he was helping now. God help him. And if his past had taught him anything, it was that once you started down this kind of road, there was rarely any turning back. The sun continued its relentless arc across the sky as they rode north into the Badlands. Two strangers bound now by necessity and a choice made in the shadow of fear. Behind them, the Rio Grande continued its ancient flow, indifferent to the human drama playing out along its banks. And somewhere in the distance, dust clouds rose from the hooves of pursuing horses, drawing ever closer to their prey. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, Belle struggling with the extra weight as they climbed higher into the rocky terrain. The woman hadn't spoken since they'd left the river, but Jake could feel the tension in her body, the way she kept turning her head to look back despite his earlier warning that it would only make her dizzy. Finally, when they reached a small plateau shielded by towering red rocks, Jake guided Belle to a stop. "We need to rest the horse," he said, dismounting first and then helping the woman down. She stumbled as her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Thank you," she said again, and he could hear how much the words cost her pride. Jake led Belle to a patch of shade, loosening her girth to give her some relief. Then he turned back to the woman, who had sunk down onto a flat rock, her face pale beneath the dirt and sun. "Reckon it's time you told me what I've gotten myself into," he said, settling onto a boulder across from her. "Starting with your name." She hesitated, fingers twisting in the torn fabric of her skirt. "Margaret," she said finally. "Margaret Campbell. Though I suppose that name won't mean much for long if Charles has his way." "Charles?" Her laugh was bitter. "Charles Thornton. He owns the Double T Ranch, about 50 miles south of here. Owns half the county, too, or acts like he does." She looked up at Jake then, those honey-colored eyes full of pain. "I was supposed to marry him. Been promised to him since I was 16, when my father owed him money. But I couldn't, not after what I saw." Jake waited, patient as he'd learned to be with spooked horses and wounded creatures. The sun beat down on them, but the rock walls provided some shelter from the worst of it. Margaret drew a shaky breath. "3 nights ago, there was a meeting at the ranch. Charles didn't know I was there. Thought I'd retired early with one of my headaches. But I couldn't sleep, so I went to the study to find a book." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The door was cracked open. I heard voices, Charles and some men I didn't recognize. They were talking about killing someone. A federal marshal who'd been investigating some cattle rustling operation." She paused, wrapping her arms around herself despite the heat. "They weren't just planning it. They were laughing about it. Like it was nothing. Like killing a man was no different than putting down a lame horse. And Charles, the man I was supposed to marry, who sat in church every Sunday and talked about Christian charity, he was the worst of them." Jake felt his jaw tighten. Cattle rustling was common enough in these parts, but killing federal lawmen? That brought a different kind of trouble entirely. "You hear any names? Details?" Margaret nodded. "Marshal James Morrison. They said he was getting too close to their operation, asking questions in Fort Stockton. Charles said they'd make it look like Indians did it, leave the body where it would spark trouble." She met Jake's eyes. "I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't marry a man who could plan such evil. So I waited until before dawn and ran. On foot. I took one of the horses at first, but it went lame after the first day. I had to leave it." She gestured at her torn dress, her scratched arms. "Been walking and hiding since then. They've been tracking me. I've seen the dust clouds. Heard them calling my name. Charles won't let me go, not knowing what I know." Jake stood and walked to the edge of their shelter, scanning the horizon. No dust clouds yet. But that didn't mean much. Good trackers could follow a trail without raising much dust, especially if they knew the country. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, not turning around. It was a harsh question, but a fair one. He'd been lied to before by desperate people, and it had cost him dearly. "I don't suppose you have any reason to," Margaret said quietly. "Except that if I were lying, if I were trying to trick you somehow, would I look like this? Would I have run myself near to death?" She stood too, swaying slightly. "I had a good life waiting for me. Mr. Sullivan. Jake Sullivan." "Mr. Sullivan. I had comfort, security, a position in society. All I had to do was close my eyes and pretend I hadn't heard what I heard, but I couldn't. My conscience wouldn't let me." Jake turned to study her. There was something in her bearing, even exhausted and frightened as she was, that spoke of steel underneath. This wasn't some flighty girl who'd run off in a romantic fit. This was a woman who'd made a terrible choice because it was the right one. "You got any proof of what you're saying? Anything that might convince a lawman?" Margaret's face fell. "No, just my word. I didn't think. I just ran. I was so frightened." Then her expression changed, became thoughtful. "But wait, Charles keeps ledgers, secret ones, in a hidden compartment in his desk. I discovered it by accident months ago. If someone could get to them, that's a mighty big if," Jake said. "And it doesn't help us now." A sound carried on the wind, the distant whinny of a horse. Both of them froze. Jake moved swiftly to Bell, checking his rifle in its saddle scabbard. Then the Colt at his hip. Could be anyone, he said, but he didn't believe it. The timing was too convenient. Margaret had gone pale again. "It's them. I know it is." She looked around wildly, as if searching for somewhere to hide in the barren rocks. Jake made a decision. "Mount up," he said curtly. "We're not running anymore today, but we're not staying here either." He helped her back onto Bell, then swung up behind her. "You ever fire a gun?" he asked as he guided the horse deeper into the rocky maze. "My father taught me to shoot a rifle," she said, "for snakes and such." "Good. You might need that knowledge before this is over." They wound through the rocks, Jake choosing paths that would be hard to follow, that would force any pursuers to go single file. His mind was racing, calculating odds and options. If Margaret was telling the truth, and his instinct said she was, then they were up against men who wouldn't hesitate to kill them both. Men with money and power and no conscience to trouble them. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked suddenly. "You don't know me. You could have ridden away." Jake was quiet for a moment, remembering another time, another plea for help. "Maybe because I did ride away once," he said finally, "and I've regretted it ever since." She didn't ask for details, and he was grateful. Some stories were better left untold, at least for now. They emerged from the rocks onto a narrow trail that led higher into the mountains. The air was cooler here, but still dry as bone. Jake could see for miles in every direction, which was both good and bad. Good because they'd spot anyone coming. Bad because anyone could spot them too. "There," Margaret said suddenly, pointing back the way they'd come. "Do you see it?" Jake did. Dust clouds, still distant but moving steadily. 4 riders, maybe 5, following their trail with the persistence of men who had too much to lose if their quarry escaped. "They'll catch us eventually," Margaret said, and he could hear despair creeping into her voice. "Bell can't outrun fresh horses carrying single riders." "Don't need to outrun them," Jake said grimly. "Just need to outsmart them." But even as he said it, he wondered if he was fooling himself. He was one man with a tired horse and a woman who could barely stay in the saddle. Against him were men who killed federal marshals without losing sleep, who had the wealth and influence to make their problems disappear. He'd wanted a quiet life, a simple existence where his biggest worry was whether there'd be enough water for his cattle. Instead, he'd thrown himself into the middle of something that could easily get them both killed. And for what? For a woman he'd met an hour ago. For a principle he'd thought he'd abandoned years back. But even as the doubts crowded in, Jake knew he wouldn't turn back. Couldn't turn back. Margaret Campbell had asked for his help, and he'd given his word, unspoken though it might have been. In this hard country, sometimes a man's word was all he had. And sometimes, Jake reflected as he urged Bell up the treacherous mountain trail, it was enough. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere behind them, Charles Thornton and his men were coming, bringing with them violence and the promise of shallow graves. But for now, Jake and Margaret rode on, 2 unlikely allies bound together by conscience and circumstance, heading into whatever fate the dying day might bring. Darkness fell like a curtain across the mountains, bringing with it a blessed coolness after the day's punishing heat. Jake had found them shelter in a narrow canyon, its entrance hidden by a fall of rocks that looked natural but would serve as a defensive position if needed. A small spring seeped from the rock face, enough to water Bell and refill their canteens. He built a small fire in a natural depression, keeping it low so the light wouldn't carry far. From his saddlebags, he produced the meager supplies he'd packed for what should have been a simple day's ride: hardtack, dried beef, and a small pouch of coffee beans. Margaret sat close to the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. In the flickering light, she looked younger, more vulnerable. The tough woman who'd outrun her pursuers for 2 days had given way to exhaustion. "Here," Jake said, handing her a piece of beef and some hardtack. "It's not much, but it'll keep your strength up." She took the food gratefully, eating slowly as if remembering her manners despite everything. "I haven't thanked you properly," she began, but Jake waved her off. "No need for that." He poured water into his small coffee pot and set it on the coals. "Tell me about this Marshall Morrison. You ever meet him?" Margaret shook her head. "No, but Charles mentioned he'd been in Fort Stockton for about a month, asking questions, said he was getting too close to their roots." She paused, staring into the fire. "They move stolen cattle through the canyons, rebrand them, then drive them south across the border or east to the rail lines. It's been going on for years." "And your father knew about this when he promised you to Thornton?" A bitter smile crossed her face. "My father knew Charles was wealthy. That's all that mattered to him. After Mama died, he lost himself in drink and debt. Charles bought up his notes, owned us both, really. Father died last winter, still believing he'd done right by me, securing such a match." Jake poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to Margaret. The familiar ritual grounded him, reminded him of countless nights on the trail before his life had gotten complicated. "What about you, Mr. Sullivan?" Margaret asked, warming her hands on the cup. "What's a man like you doing living alone out here?" Jake was quiet for a moment, listening to the night sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the canyon. "Trying to forget, mostly," he said finally. "Had a ranch up north, near Amarillo. Had a wife, too, Sarah." The name still hurt to say, even after 3 years. Margaret waited, not pushing, and Jake found himself continuing. "There was trouble with some local boys. Thought they could take what they wanted from smaller ranchers. I stood up to them." He took a long sip of coffee, remembering. "They came while I was away at market, burned the house, shot Sarah when she tried to stop them. By the time I got back, 'I'm so sorry,' Margaret whispered. I went after them." Jake continued, his voice flat. "Found them too, but the law said I couldn't prove they'd done it. Said I was a troublemaker, trying to stir things up. One of them was the judge's nephew. You see, they gave me a choice. Leave the county or hang for disturbing the peace." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "So I left, came south, bought a small spread where no one knew me. Figured if I kept to myself, didn't get involved in other folks' problems, maybe I could find some peace. But you got involved with mine," Margaret said softly. Jake looked at her across the fire. "Yeah, well, maybe a man can only run from himself for so long." A wolf howled somewhere in the darkness, closer than before, and bells stirred nervously where Jake had picketed her. He stood, hand moving to his rifle, but the sound wasn't repeated. "We should take turns keeping watch," he said. "You sleep first. I'll wake you in a few hours." Margaret looked like she wanted to protest, but exhaustion won. Jake spread his bedroll near the fire and helped her settle onto it. She was asleep almost instantly, her face relaxing into something almost peaceful. Jake positioned himself on a flat rock where he could see the canyon entrance, rifle across his knees. The night stretched out before him, full of memories and possibilities. Somewhere out there, Charles Thornton and his men were making camp too, planning how to catch their quarry come daylight. As the hours passed, Jake found himself studying Margaret's sleeping face in the firelight. What kind of courage did it take for a woman raised in comfort to throw it all away for conscience? To run into the wilderness rather than close her eyes to evil? He'd known men who'd done far less when tested. The fire burned low, and he added a few small branches, careful not to make too much smoke. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Sarah had loved the stars, knew all their names and stories. She would have liked Margaret, he thought, would have admired her backbone. A sound made him tense, the clatter of a displaced rock somewhere beyond the firelight. Jake rose silently, rifle ready, moving into the shadows. Long minutes passed before he identified the source, a family of javelinas rooting through the brush. He returned to his post, nerves still singing. Near midnight. He gently shook Margaret awake. She came to consciousness quickly, fear flashing in her eyes before she recognized him. "Your turn," he said quietly. "Just watch the canyon mouth. If you see or hear anything unusual, wake me. Don't hesitate." She nodded, taking his place on the rock while he stretched out on the hard ground. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Too many years of living on the edge had made him a light sleeper, aware of every sound. He woke once to find Margaret feeding small sticks to the dying fire, her profile thoughtful in the orange glow. She noticed him watching and gave a small smile. "Just thinking," she whispered, "about how different my life was 3 days ago. How I was worried about wedding dress fittings and menu planning, and now—" She gestured at the wild canyon around them. "Now I'm grateful just to be alive." "Regrets?" Jake asked. She considered the question seriously. "No. Whatever happens, I couldn't have lived with myself knowing what I knew and doing nothing. My mother raised me to know right from wrong. I just wish—" "What?" "I wish I could get word to Marshal Morrison somehow. Warn him, but even if we could reach Fort Stockton, would he believe me? A runaway bride with a wild story?" Jake sat up, an idea forming. "Maybe, depends on how much he already suspects. Federal marshals don't work alone. He'll have reported to someone. If something happens to him after you tried to warn him, there'll be questions." Hope flickered in Margaret's eyes. "Then we have to try, even if Charles catches up to us. We have to try." The rest of the night passed quietly. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake made a decision. Running wasn't enough. They needed a plan, and they needed allies. Fort Stockton was 2 days' hard ride, but it was their best chance. He woke Margaret as the first birds began their morning songs. "We move at first light," he told her, "and we head for Fort Stockton." She nodded, understanding the risk. They were gambling everything on reaching a marshal who might not believe them, in a town where Thornton likely had influence. But it was better than running blindly until their luck ran out, as they prepared to leave their sanctuary. Jake caught Margaret's arm. "Whatever happens from here, you need to know. You did the right thing. Not many would have had your courage." She looked up at him, and something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, a connection forged by shared danger and mutual respect. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me, for helping me, for being the kind of man who couldn't ride away." Jake nodded, throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. Then he helped her mount Belle, swung up behind her, and guided them out of the canyon into the new day. Behind them, their cold campfire sent a last thin tendril of smoke into the brightening sky, marking where two strangers had become something more in the darkness of a desert night. The morning sun climbed mercilessly as they pushed deeper into the mountains. The trail Jake had chosen was barely more than a goat path, winding between massive boulders and along crumbling ledges. Belle picked her way carefully, but Jake could feel her laboring under the double burden and the increasingly treacherous terrain. By midday, Margaret was swaying dangerously in the saddle. The heat had returned with a vengeance, bouncing off the rocks and creating shimmering waves of air that made distant objects dance and waver. They'd rationed their water carefully, but both canteens were nearly empty. "There's a seasonal creek about 2 miles ahead," Jake said, as much to break the oppressive silence as to offer hope. "Might still have some water in the deeper pools." Margaret nodded weakly, her hands gripping the saddle horn with white knuckles. The scratches on her arms had become angry red welts, and Jake suspected infection was setting in. She needed proper care, clean water, and rest, none of which he could provide while they were being hunted. They found the creek bed exactly where Jake remembered it, but, as he'd feared, it was bone dry except for a few muddy puddles that even Belle turned her nose up at. The disappointment seemed to drain the last of Margaret's strength. "I can't," she whispered, sliding from the saddle before Jake could catch her. She landed hard on her knees in the sandy creek bed, shoulders shaking with exhaustion or tears or both. I'm slowing you down. You should leave me. Take Belle and ride hard for Fort Stockton. At least then someone would know. Stop that talk, Jake said sharply, dismounting and kneeling beside her. Nobody's leaving anybody. He helped her to a patch of shade under an overhanging rock. We'll rest here a bit. That's when he saw them. Dust clouds again. Closer than before. Maybe 3 miles back, possibly less. The pursuers had found their trail and were closing the gap. Jake's mind raced. Belle couldn't outrun fresh horses. Not carrying 2 riders through this terrain, they needed another option. His eyes swept the surrounding landscape. Years of survival instincts kicking in. There, a narrow defile between 2 cliff faces, barely visible from their current position. "Can you walk a short distance?" he asked Margaret. She looked up at him, saw something in his expression, and nodded. "I'll try." Jake quickly led Belle into the defile, which opened into a small box canyon. Perfect. 1 way in, 1 way out, with high walls that would give him a defensive advantage. He helped Margaret to a protected spot behind some fallen rocks, then handed her his rifle. "You remember what your father taught you about shooting?" Her eyes widened as she understood. "You're going to make a stand here?" "No choice now." Jake checked his Colt, counting bullets. "They want to play rough. We'll give them rough. You see anybody trying to flank us up those walls, you put a shot near them. Don't have to hit them. Just make them think twice." Margaret took the rifle with steady hands, checking the action like someone who did indeed know her way around firearms. "Jake," she said, using his first name for the first time. "I'm sorry I brought this to you." "Don't be," he said, surprising himself by meaning it. "Been a long time since I felt like I was doing something that mattered." He positioned himself behind a boulder near the canyon entrance, where he'd have clear shots at anyone trying to enter. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched like hours, the sun beating down relentlessly. Jake's shirt was soaked with sweat, but his hands remained steady. Then he heard them. Horses' hooves on rock, voices carrying on the still air. They'd found the defile. "Sullivan!" The voice boomed off the canyon walls. "Jake Sullivan! We know you're in there!" Jake didn't recognize the voice, but he wasn't surprised they knew his name. Men like Thornton had ways of finding out what they needed to know. "Send the woman out," the voice continued. "This ain't your fight. Sullivan, no need for you to die over Charles Thornton's runaway bride." Jake glanced back at Margaret. She had the rifle raised, sighting down the barrel at the rim of the canyon. Her face was pale, but determined. "How about you boys turn around and head home?" Jake called back, "Tell Thornton his wedding's off." Harsh laughter echoed off the rocks. "Can't do that, friend. Girl knows things she shouldn't, mister. Thornton's willing to make it worth your while, though $500 in gold if you send her out. You can ride away rich. Not interested. $1,000. That's his final offer." Jake spat in the dust. "Tell Thornton he can take his gold and—" The first shot cut off his words, chipping rock inches from his head. Jake dropped behind his boulder as more shots followed, the canyon filling with the thunder of gunfire and the whine of ricochets. When the barrage paused, Jake risked a look. He could see movement at the canyon mouth. They were going to try to rush him. He took careful aim and fired. A man cried out and fell back. "That's one," Jake muttered, ducking as return fire peppered his position. A shot rang out from behind him. Margaret's rifle. He glanced back to see her lever another round into the chamber, eyes fixed on the canyon rim. "Saw someone climbing," she said tightly. The siege settled into a deadly pattern. Thornton's men would try to advance. Jake would drive them back. Twice more. Margaret's rifle spoke, keeping them from gaining the high ground. But Jake knew their ammunition wouldn't last forever, and neither would their luck. During a lull, one of the attackers called out again. "This is Tom Bradley, Sullivan. I'm Thornton's foreman. Been authorized to up the offer, $5,000 in safe passage. That's more money than you'll see in a lifetime of pushing cattle." "Not about money," Jake replied. "Then what? You sweet on the girl? She ain't worth dying for, Cowboy. Just another rich man's daughter who couldn't mind her place. Jake felt anger rise in his chest. She's worth 10 of you boys who'd murder a federal marshal for your boss's profit. Silence greeted this statement. Then Bradley's voice came again, harder now. So she did tell you? Well, that settles it then. Can't have either of you riding out of here now. The attack renewed with fresh intensity. Jake counted at least 5 different guns firing. His ammunition was running low, maybe a dozen rounds left between his rifle and pistol. Margaret was down to her last few shots as well. As the shadows began to lengthen, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold movement in the rocks above. Despite Margaret's vigilance, someone had found a way up the cliff face. "Behind us!" he hissed to Margaret. Spinning to face the new threat, a figure appeared on a ledge 30 feet up, rifle aimed down at them. Jake and the man fired at the same instant. Jake felt the bullet tug at his shirt, burning a line across his ribs. The man above wasn't so lucky. He tumbled from the ledge, landing with a sickening thud, but the damage was done. With Jake turned away, 2 men rushed the canyon entrance. He spun back, firing rapidly, dropping one, but the other dove behind cover inside the canyon. They'd lost their defensive advantage. "Fall back," Jake ordered, grabbing Margaret's hand and pulling her deeper into the box canyon. His side was wet with blood, though the wound didn't feel deep. They retreated until their backs were literally against the wall. Jake had 3 rounds left. Margaret's rifle was empty. Around them, the shadows deepened as the sun sank toward the western peaks. "Jake, you're hurt," Margaret said, seeing the blood. "Been hurt worse." He reloaded his last 3 bullets, hands steady despite everything. "Whatever happens, you did good. Your mother would be proud." Margaret moved closer to him, and he felt her hand slip into his. "I'm not sorry," she said fiercely. "Whatever happens, I'm not sorry for any of it." Bradley's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Last chance. Sullivan. Sun's going down. Be ashamed to die in the dark." Jake was about to reply when he heard something else. Horses. Many horses. Moving fast. Bradley must have heard it too because the shooting stopped abruptly. A new voice rang out, strong with authority. "Tom Bradley. This is Deputy Federal Marshal John Carter. You and your men throw down your weapons and come out with hands high." Jake felt Margaret's hand tighten on his. "Federal marshals? But how?" "We got nothing to do with federal law," Bradley shouted back, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "That's so?" Marshal Carter replied. "Then you won't mind explaining why you're hunting the woman who sent us a telegram from San Felipe 3 days ago, warning us about a threat to Marshal Morrison's life, or why Morrison's body was found this morning, killed exactly the way she described?" Margaret gasped. "San Felipe, the depot where I left the horse. I sent a wire, but I didn't think it got through. The operator said the lines were down." "Looks like he lied," Jake said, feeling a grim smile tug at his lips. The sound of weapons hitting the ground echoed through the canyon, one by one. Thornton's men emerged with hands raised. Federal deputies moved in, efficient and professional. Jake helped Margaret to her feet, keeping his arm around her as they walked slowly toward the canyon entrance. A tall man with a marshal's badge met them halfway. "Miss Campbell, I'm Deputy Marshal Carter. Your telegram reached us, but too late to save Morrison. We've been looking for you ever since." His eyes took in their condition. Margaret's torn dress and fevered scratches. Jake's bloody shirt. "Looks like we almost arrived too late for you too. This is Jake Sullivan," Margaret said. "He saved my life, protected me when he had no reason to." Carter extended his hand to Jake. "The federal government owes you a debt. Mr. Sullivan. Takes a brave man to stand against Thornton's outfit." Jake shook the offered hand, wincing slightly at the movement. "Just did what needed doing." As the deputies secured their prisoners, Carter filled them in. Margaret's telegram had been forwarded to the regional federal office. When Morrison was found dead yesterday morning, killed in exactly the manner she'd described, a team of marshals had been dispatched immediately. "We've got enough to arrest Thornton now," Carter said. "Your testimony, Miss Campbell, combined with what we've uncovered about his rustling operation, will put him away for a long time." As they prepared to leave the canyon, Margaret turned to Jake. In the fading light, her eyes were luminous. "What will you do now?" Jake considered the question. His quiet life by the river seemed like something from another lifetime. "Reckon I'll see you safe to Fort Stockton first. Make sure you get proper care for those scratches." He paused, then added quietly, "After that, well, maybe it's time I stopped hiding from the world." Margaret smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "I'd like that. I mean, having you along to Fort Stockton." She glanced away, then back. "Maybe after that too, if you were willing. I'll need to find somewhere to start over, and I'd feel safer with a friend nearby." Friend. Jake tested the word and found it didn't quite fit what he felt growing between them. But there would be time to explore that later, when she wasn't fevered and exhausted, when he wasn't bleeding from a bullet graze. "Reckon I could do that," he said simply. As they rode out of the canyon, Jake on Bell, Margaret on a horse provided by the marshals, the last rays of sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, Thornton's men were shackled and under guard. Their reign of terror ended by one woman's courage and one man's decision to help. The trail ahead led to Fort Stockton, to testimony and justice, to an uncertain future. But for the first time in 3 years, Jake Sullivan found himself looking forward instead of back. Beside him, Margaret Campbell rode with her head high despite her exhaustion. A woman who had lost everything and gained her freedom. They'd found each other in violence and fear, but something stronger had grown between them in those desperate hours. Trust, perhaps, respect, certainly, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something that could heal old wounds and create new possibilities. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as they descended from the mountains. Sarah would have known their names, Jake thought, and she would have understood why he couldn't ride away this time. Some things were worth the risk. Some people were worth saving. And sometimes, in saving someone else, a man might just save himself. The journey to Fort Stockton took 2 days under Marshal Carter's protection. They made camp the first night near Comanche Springs, where clear water bubbled up from the earth, a blessed relief after their ordeal in the mountains. Margaret's fever had broken, though the scratches on her arms still looked angry and inflamed. Jake sat by the campfire, watching as the deputy marshal's wife, Mrs. Carter, who had joined the party at a way station, tended to Margaret's wounds with gentle efficiency. She'd brought medical supplies and clean clothes, transforming Margaret from a desperate fugitive back into something resembling the lady she'd been. "You're lucky," Mrs. Carter was saying as she applied a salve to the scratches. "Another day or two and these would have gone septic." Jake knew she was right. He'd seen men die from infected wounds, watched fever consume them from the inside out. The thought of Margaret suffering that fate made something twist in his chest. Deputy Marshal Carter approached, settling onto a log beside Jake. "Doc in Fort Stockton will want to look at that graze of yours," he said, nodding toward Jake's bandaged ribs. "It's nothing," Jake replied automatically. Carter chuckled. "You remind me of Morrison, stubborn as a mule when it came to admitting he needed help." His expression grew somber. "He was a good man, would have appreciated what you did, protecting Miss Campbell." "She protected herself mostly," Jake said. "Took down at least 2 men trying to flank us on the canyon rim. Most women would have fallen apart." "Most women haven't had to make the choice she did," Carter observed. "Takes a special kind of courage to give up everything for principle." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire crackle. Around them, the deputies maintained a watchful perimeter. Thornton was rich enough to hire more guns, though word of the federal involvement would likely give him pause. "What'll happen to her after the trial?" Jake asked finally. Carter shrugged. "Hard to say. Thornton's assets will likely be seized, but she wasn't married to him yet. So she won't see any of that. No family to speak of. From what she's told us, she'll need to make her own way. The thought troubled Jake more than he cared to admit. Margaret had shown remarkable strength, but the world wasn't kind to women alone, especially those without money or connections. Later that evening, after Mrs. Carter had retired to her tent, Margaret joined Jake by the fire. She'd changed into a simple blue dress that made her look younger, more vulnerable. The fierce woman who'd stood beside him in the canyon seemed like a dream. "Thank you," she said softly, settling beside him on the log. "I know I've said it before, but—" "No need," Jake interrupted. "We've been through this." She smiled slightly. "You don't like gratitude much, do you? Just don't see the point. Did what needed doing." "Is that really all it was?" Margaret asked, turning to study his profile in the firelight. "Just duty." Jake was quiet for a long moment, aware of her gaze, of the way the fire brought out copper hints in her dark hair. "No," he admitted finally. "No, it wasn't just duty." Something shifted between them then, an acknowledgement of what had been building since that first desperate plea by the river. But before either could speak further, a commotion arose from the edge of camp. One of the deputies was escorting a rider into the firelight, a young man on a tethered horse, dust-covered and nervous. Jake recognized the type, a hired messenger, paid to deliver news fast. "Got a message for Marshal Carter," the young man announced. "From Fort Stockton." Carter took the paper, read it by the firelight, and his face darkened. "Thornton's made bail," he announced to the group. "Judge Harrington signed the order this afternoon, $5,000 bond." Jake felt Margaret tense beside him. "But how? You said there was enough evidence." "To arrest him, yes," Carter said grimly. "To convict him. We need your testimony, and Harrington's been in Thornton's pocket for years, though we could never prove it." He turned to his men. "Double the watch tonight, and send word ahead. I want extra security when we reach town." The rest of the evening passed uneasily. Jake walked Margaret to the tent she shared with Mrs. Carter, both of them aware that the danger wasn't over. "I should have known it wouldn't be that easy," Margaret said bitterly. "Men like Charles always find a way to slip free." "Not this time," Jake said firmly. "Federal prosecutors aren't local law. They can't be bought as easily." She looked up at him, moonlight silvering her features. "Will you stay? For the trial? I mean, I know you have your ranch to get back to." "Ranch'll keep," Jake said. "I'll stay as long as you need me." The next morning brought new challenges. As they approached Fort Stockton, it became clear that news of recent events had spread. People lined the streets, some curious, others hostile. Thornton had friends here, men who'd profited from his operations. They took rooms at the Stockton Hotel, with deputies posted in the hallway. Jake's room was next to Margaret's, close enough that he could hear if there was trouble. The doctor came, pronouncing Margaret's wounds healing well, and Jake's graze lucky. An inch lower and we'd be having a different conversation. That evening, the federal prosecutor arrived, a stern man named David Ashford who wore his authority like armor. He interviewed Margaret for 3 hours, Jake present at her request, going over every detail of what she'd heard and seen. "It's good," Ashford said finally. "Combined with the evidence we've gathered and the attack on you, we can make a strong case. But I won't lie. Miss Campbell, Thornton's hired the best lawyers money can buy. They'll try to destroy your credibility, paint you as a hysterical woman, a jilted bride seeking revenge." "Let them try," Margaret said with quiet steel. "I know what I heard." That night, Jake found sleep elusive. He stood by his window, watching the street below, hand never far from his gun. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. He'd protected Margaret this far, but in a courtroom, she'd be on her own. A soft knock at his door made him turn. Margaret stood in the hallway, wrapped in a shawl, looking lost. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Keep thinking about tomorrow, about facing him in court." Jake stepped aside. letting her in. Propriety be damned. They'd moved past such concerns in the mountains. She settled into the room's single chair while he leaned against the window frame. "You'll do fine," he said. "Just tell the truth like you told Ashford." "It's not the telling I'm afraid of," she said. "It's seeing Charles again, remembering how I almost tied my life to his, how I was willing to ignore the signs." She shuddered. "What kind of woman does that make me?" "A human one," Jake said. "We all make mistakes. Margaret, what matters is what we do when we see the truth." She looked at him then with such vulnerability that he had to fight the urge to go to her, to offer comfort more substantial than words. "Is that what you tell yourself? About your wife? About leaving Amarillo?" The question hit him unexpectedly. "I tell myself I survived," he said slowly. "That living another day gave me the chance to do some good. Like helping you." Margaret rose, crossing to stand before him. "We're a pair, aren't we? Both of us running from the past, finding each other in the middle of nowhere." She reached up, touching the edge of the bandage visible beneath his shirt. "This should never have happened. You should never have been hurt because of my troubles." "Margaret." Her name came out rougher than he intended. "I'd take a dozen bullets if it meant keeping you safe." Her eyes widened at the admission. Then, before he could think to stop her, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips softly to his. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, lasting only a moment before she pulled back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize," Jake said, his voice low. "Just not now, not with tomorrow hanging over us. When this is done, when you're safe and Thornton's behind bars, then we'll see what's between us. Do it proper." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You're right. I needed you to know. In case. Nothing's going to happen," Jake said firmly. "I'll be right there in the courtroom. Carter and his men will be there. You're going to testify. Thornton's going to prison, and then you'll be free to start whatever life you choose." "With you?" The question was barely audible. "If you'll have me," Jake admitted. "Though Lord knows why you'd want a broken-down cowboy with more scars than sense." Margaret smiled then, the expression transforming her face. "Because that broken-down cowboy rode into hell for a stranger. Because he's the most honorable man I've ever known. Because when I'm with him, I feel like I can face anything." Jake felt something ease in his chest. A knot he hadn't known was there. "Better get some sleep," he said gently. "Big day tomorrow?" She nodded, moving toward the door, then paused. "Jake, whatever happens tomorrow, these past days, they've changed me. Show me who I really am. I wouldn't trade that for anything." After she left, Jake returned to his vigil at the window. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Thornton's lawyers, hostile crowds, the weight of justice hanging in the balance. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of hope. He'd come to the river seeking water and found instead a woman who'd reawakened his heart. He'd thought himself beyond redemption, content to live out his days in solitude. But Margaret had shown him differently. In saving her, perhaps he'd saved himself as well. The moon rode high over Fort Stockton, casting silver shadows on the dusty streets. Somewhere in this town, Charles Thornton was likely plotting his next move, surrounded by lawyers and sycophants. But Jake Sullivan stood guard, a protector who'd already proven he'd face down any threat for the woman who'd whispered a desperate plea by the river. Tomorrow would test them both, but tonight, with Margaret's kiss still warm on his lips, and her faith in him glowing like a candle in the darkness, Jake felt ready for whatever came next. The past was done. The future waited. And for the first time in 3 years, he was eager to meet it. The morning of the trial dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Jake dressed carefully in his best shirt, the one he'd packed for town visits, and strapped on his gun belt. Marshal Carter had warned him that weapons weren't allowed in the courtroom, but Jake intended to be armed until the last possible moment. He knocked on Margaret's door at 7 sharp. "Mrs." Carter answered, her face grave. "She's ready," the older woman said softly. "Though Lord knows how, Poor child barely slept. Margaret emerged wearing a modest gray dress that Mrs. Carter had procured, her hair pinned up severely. She looked pale but composed, every inch the respectable woman rather than the desperate fugitive he'd found by the river. "How do I look?" she asked, attempting a smile. "Like someone telling the truth," Jake replied, offering his arm. The walk to the courthouse was tense. Word had spread through Fort Stockton like wildfire. Charles Thornton's former bride would testify against him, would speak of murder and corruption. The streets were fuller than usual, clusters of people watching their small procession with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "Shameless woman," someone hissed as they passed, turning on the man who would have given her everything. Jake felt Margaret's hand tighten on his arm, but she kept her head high, eyes forward. He recognized several of Thornton's ranch hands lounging against building fronts, their stares heavy with threat. Deputy marshals flanked their group, hands resting on their weapons. The courthouse was a modest two-story building of local stone, trying hard to project authority in a town more accustomed to frontier justice. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Jake spotted Thornton immediately, sitting at the defendant's table like a king holding court, surrounded by three expensive-looking lawyers from Austin. Charles Thornton was everything Jake had expected, a handsome man in his 40s with silver at his temples and cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of profit and loss. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit and an expression of mild inconvenience, as if this whole affair was beneath his attention. When he saw Margaret, his lips curved in a smile that made Jake's blood run cold. "Courage," Jake murmured to Margaret as a bailiff approached to escort her to the witness area. She looked up at him once more. "Don't let them make me disappear," she whispered, voicing a fear they both shared. Then she was gone, following the bailiff to her seat. Jake found a place in the gallery where he could see both Margaret and Thornton. Marshal Carter sat nearby, alert and watchful. The federal prosecutor, Ashford, looked confident but wary. He knew the defense would fight dirty. Judge William Prescott entered, a circuit judge from Austin whom the federal authorities had specifically requested. Unlike Judge Harrington, Prescott had a reputation for fairness. He called the court to order with sharp raps of his gavel. The morning was consumed with procedural matters and opening statements. Ashford painted a picture of Thornton as a ruthless cattle baron who'd built his empire on theft and murder. The lead defense attorney, a smooth-talking man named Cornelius Webb, countered by describing his client as a pillar of the community, victim of a vindictive woman's lies, when Margaret was finally called to testify after the noon recess. Jake could see her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the Bible, but her voice was clear as she swore to tell the truth. Ashford led her through the story methodically, her engagement to Thornton, the overheard conversation about killing Marshal Morrison, her flight and pursuit. Margaret spoke simply, without embellishment, her eyes never leaving the prosecutor despite the weight of Thornton's stare. "And you're certain of what you heard?" Ashford asked. "There's no possibility you misunderstood?" "None," Margaret said firmly. Charles laughed when he described how they'd make it look like Indians killed the marshal. He said Morrison was getting too close to their roots through Devil's Canyon. Then came the cross-examination. Webb approached Margaret like a snake, all false sympathy and hidden fangs. "Miss Campbell," he began, "isn't it true that you were reluctant to marry my client?" "I had agreed to the marriage," Margaret replied carefully. "But you weren't happy about it, were you? In fact, you'd been looking for any excuse to break the engagement." "That's not true. I was prepared to honor my father's agreement until you supposedly overheard this convenient conversation," Webb interrupted. "Tell me, why should we believe a woman who admits she was sneaking around the house at night, eavesdropping on private discussions?" The questioning grew more brutal. Webb painted Margaret as unstable, hysterical, a woman who'd rather see an innocent man hanged than submit to marriage. He brought up her father's debts, suggesting she'd hoped to inherit Thornton's wealth as a widow. He questioned her virtue, implying that her flight with Jake had been planned, that she'd been carrying on with another man. Jake's hands clenched into fists as he watched Margaret weather the assault. She answered each accusation calmly, but he could see the toll it was taking. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool day. "And this man you ran to," Webb continued, gesturing toward Jake. "This drifter who shot down 5 of Mr. Thornton's employees." "Objection," Ashford called. "Mr. Sullivan is not on trial here, and those men were attempting to commit murder." "Sustained," Judge Prescott ruled. "Keep to the facts of Miss Campbell's testimony, Mr. Webb." But the damage was done. Webb had painted them both as killers, outsiders who'd brought violence to peaceful Fort Stockton. Jake saw several jury members frowning, doubt creeping into their expressions. The afternoon wore on, brutal and exhausting. Margaret held her ground, but Webb was relentless, twisting her words, making her repeat parts of her story until they sounded rehearsed. Through it all, Thornton sat watching with that same cold smile, occasionally whispering to his lawyers. When Webb finally finished, Margaret looked drained, her dress damp with perspiration. But she'd survived. She'd told her truth. "Redirect, Your Honor." Ashford stood. "Miss Campbell, one simple question. Knowing what you risked, your reputation, your safety, your future, why did you run?" Margaret straightened in her chair, and for the first time all day, looked directly at Thornton. "Because I couldn't live with myself if Marshall Morrison died when I could have prevented it. Because right and wrong matter more than comfort or safety. Because that's how my mother raised me." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jake saw several women in the gallery nodding approval, and even some of the men looked thoughtful. Thornton's smile finally slipped. "No further questions," Ashford said. As Margaret stepped down from the witness stand, she had to pass near Thornton's table. Jake tensed, ready to leap the gallery rail if necessary. Thornton leaned back in his chair, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You always were too much like your mother, Margaret, too principled for your own good. Look where it got her. Dead at 30, leaving a drunk husband and a daughter who doesn't know her place." Margaret stopped, her back rigid. For a moment, Jake thought she might strike Thornton. Then she continued walking, head high, leaving Thornton's poison behind her. The rest of the day was consumed with testimony from Marshall Carter about finding Morrison's body, exactly as Margaret had described. The defense fought hard, but the evidence was mounting. When Judge Prescott called a recess until morning, Jake could see worry creeping into Thornton's eyes. Outside the courthouse, Jake finally reached Margaret, pulling her into the shelter of a doorway as crowds milled past. She was shaking now, the strain of the day catching up. "You did it," he said. "You faced him down and told your truth." "Webb made me sound like a vindictive liar," she said bitterly. "Did you see the jury? Some of them believed him." "Some," Jake agreed, "but not all. And tomorrow Ashford will make his case. The evidence is strong. Margaret, your testimony gave it life." She leaned against him for a moment. Just a moment. Drawing strength. "I wanted to strike him," she admitted. "When he mentioned my mother, she died of fever. Jake, nursing other people's children because my father had drunk away everything. Thornton knew that. He knew how much it hurt." "But you didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing it," Jake said. "You walked away with dignity. That took more strength than throwing a punch." That evening, back at the hotel, the atmosphere was tense. Marshall Carter posted extra guards, wary of Thornton's desperation. Jake took his supper in Margaret's room. Both of them, too, wound up to eat much. "What if they acquit him?" Margaret asked, pushing food around her plate. "What if all this was for nothing?" "Then we deal with that when it comes," Jake said. "But it won't be for nothing. You stood up. You bore witness." "That matters, whatever the outcome." A commotion in the street drew them to the window. A crowd had gathered outside the hotel, some carrying torches despite the early hour. Jake recognized several Thornton supporters, including Tom Bradley, out on bail. "Send her out," someone shouted. "Let Thornton's boys have a word with the lying witch." Disperse immediately. Marshal Carter's voice boomed from the hotel entrance. By order of federal authority. The crowd milled uncertainly. These were men used to local law they could intimidate or bribe, not federal marshals with the weight of Washington behind them. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to break up, though not before several more threats were shouted. They hate me, Margaret said quietly. Even if Thornton goes to prison, I'll never be safe here. Jake turned her away from the window. Then you won't stay here. World's bigger than Fort Stockton. Margaret, plenty of places where a woman of courage can make a fresh start. Alone? The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Jake thought of his empty ranch, his solitary life, the walls he'd built around his heart. Then he thought of these past days, the partnership forged in danger, the trust built through hardship, the woman who'd made him feel alive again. No, he said simply. Not alone. Not if you don't want to be. Before she could respond. Mrs. Carter knocked, bringing news. Mr. Ashford wants to meet with you both, says there's been a development. They found the prosecutor in Marshal Carter's room, looking grimly satisfied. One of Thornton's men wants to make a deal, he announced. Sam Morrison, no relation to the marshal. He's willing to testify about the rustling operation in exchange for reduced charges. Hope flared in Margaret's eyes. Will that be enough? Combined with your testimony and the physical evidence, it should be. Ashford's expression softened slightly. You did well today, Miss Campbell. I know it wasn't easy. She was magnificent, Jake said firmly. Margaret flushed at the praise. That night, Jake resumed his vigil, sitting in a chair outside Margaret's door with his rifle across his knees. Marshal Carter had offered to post a deputy, but Jake had refused. This was his responsibility, his privilege. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, jury deliberations, verdict. Tomorrow might see justice done or perverted, but tonight he would stand guard over the woman who'd changed everything, who'd reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. In the darkest hour before dawn, Margaret's door opened softly. She stood there in her wrapper, hair down around her shoulders. You should rest, she said. The deputies are watching. I'm where I need to be, Jake replied. She studied him for a long moment, then bent and kissed his cheek softly. My protector, she whispered. My unlikely hero. Then she was gone, the door closing quietly, leaving Jake with the warmth of her kiss and the certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, his life had found its purpose again. The sun would rise, the trial would end, and somehow, he and Margaret would face whatever came next, together. The final day of the trial arrived with an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air. Storm clouds that had threatened for days finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the courthouse windows. Inside, every seat was filled, with more people crowding the aisles until Judge Prescott ordered them cleared. Jake sat in his now familiar spot, watching Margaret take her place with the other witnesses. She wore the same gray dress, but something in her bearing had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet determination that reminded him of steel forged in fire. Prosecutor Ashford rose for his closing argument, his voice carrying over the drumming rain. He painted a picture of corruption and murder, of a wealthy man who believed himself above the law. He reminded the jury of Margaret's courage, of the federal marshal who died for getting too close to the truth. Charles Thornton built an empire on the blood and suffering of others. Ashford concluded, it's time for justice to tear it down. Then came Webb's turn. The defense attorney was brilliant, Jake had to admit. He wove doubt like a master craftsman, questioning every piece of evidence, painting his client as a successful businessman targeted by jealous competitors and a spurned woman. Where's the proof? Webb demanded. Where are the stolen cattle, the altered brands? All we have is the word of a woman who fled her wedding bed for the arms of another man. He gestured dramatically toward Jake. A man who killed 5 of Mr. Thornton's employees. They were defending themselves, someone shouted from the gallery. Mrs. Carter, her usual composure cracking. Judge Prescott's gavel cracked down. "Order! Another outburst and I'll clear this courtroom." As Webb continued his passionate defense, Jake noticed movement near the back doors. Tom Bradley had entered. Despite being out on bail for the Canyon attack, he caught Thornton's eye and nodded slightly. Jake's instincts screamed danger. The jury retired to deliberate just before noon. The waiting was agony. Margaret paced the witness room while Jake stood guard outside, Marshal Carter beside him. "Bradley's up to something," Jake warned. Carter nodded grimly. "I've got men watching him, but he's smart enough not to try anything in the courthouse." Hours crawled by. The rain intensified, turning the streets to mud. Thunder rattled the windows. Then, just as the clock struck 3, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Thornton sat calmly, but Jake noticed the white knuckles of his clenched hands. Margaret was pale but steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Prescott asked. The foreman, a weathered rancher named Harrison, stood. "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of conspiracy to murder Federal Marshal James Morrison." "How do you find—" Harrison cleared his throat. "Guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted. Thornton surged to his feet, face contorted with rage. "You fools!" he shouted. "You believe that lying witch over me? I own this town." "Silence!" Judge Prescott hammered his gavel. "Continue, Mr. Foreman. On the charge of cattle rustling. Guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of Miss Margaret Campbell. Guilty." With each verdict, Thornton's composure crumbled further. He turned toward Margaret, eyes blazing with hatred. "You'll pay for this. You think you're safe? You think that saddle tramp can protect you forever? Remove the defendant," Judge Prescott ordered. Deputies moved in, but Thornton wasn't finished. "Bradley!" he shouted. "Now!" Chaos erupted. Tom Bradley pulled a hidden pistol, aiming for Margaret. Jake was already moving, throwing himself between them as the gun fired. The bullet caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another shot rang out, Marshal Carter's gun, and Bradley crumpled. "Jake!" Margaret's scream cut through the pandemonium. Jake found himself on the floor, Margaret cradling his head, her hands already red with his blood. The shoulder burned like fire, but he'd had worse. "I'm all right," he managed. "Just a scratch." "You fool," she sobbed. "You wonderful, stupid fool." Deputies swarmed the courtroom, restoring order. A doctor pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside Jake. "Clean through," he announced after a quick examination. "Lucky. Few inches lower." As they helped Jake to a bench, Judge Prescott regained control. "Charles Thornton," he intoned, voice cold as winter iron. "I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none." Thornton, now shackled, was dragged past them. He paused, looking down at Jake and Margaret with pure venom. "This isn't over," he hissed. "I have friends, resources. You'll never be safe." "That's where you're wrong," Marshal Carter said, stepping forward. "Your assets are frozen, pending seizure by federal authorities. Your men are scattering like rats. Your empire's finished. Thornton, you're just another convict now." As they led Thornton away, Jake felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. It was over. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The doctor insisted on properly treating Jake's wound at his office. Margaret refused to leave his side, holding his hand as the doctor cleaned and bandaged the injury. The laudanum they gave him for pain made everything fuzzy, but he was aware of Margaret's presence, her voice, her touch. "Twice now," she murmured. "Twice you've been shot protecting me." "Worth it," Jake mumbled, words slurring. "Both times." That evening, back at the hotel, the atmosphere was one of subdued victory. Thornton was in custody, awaiting transport to federal prison. His network was crumbling, but the violence in the courtroom had cast a shadow over the triumph. Jake woke from a laudanum-induced doze to find Margaret sitting beside his bed, reading by lamplight. She'd changed into a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "How long was I out?" he asked. She smiled, setting aside her book. "Few hours. The doctor says you'll be fine, though you'll need to rest that shoulder for a while." Her expression grew serious. "Jake, what you did today, what I'd do again tomorrow," he interrupted. "And the day after that." She leaned forward, taking his good hand in both of hers. "I know. That's what frightens me. How many times can you throw yourself between me and a bullet before—" She couldn't finish. "Margaret." He squeezed her hands. "It's over. Thornton's going to prison. You're safe now." "Am I?" She looked toward the window, where rain still pattered against the glass. "You heard what he said. He has friends, money hidden away. What if— Then we'll deal with it," Jake said firmly. "Together." The word hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Margaret studied his face, seeming to search for something. "You meant what you said before, about me not being alone?" "Every word." Jake struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. "Margaret, I know we've only known each other a short while, and most of that was running for our lives, but that is, if you're willing." She silenced him with a gentle kiss, careful of his injuries. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Whatever you're trying to ask, yes." A knock at the door interrupted them. Marshal Carter entered, looking pleased despite the day's violence. "Thought you'd want to know. We've rounded up most of Thornton's gang. Sam Morrison's testimony is giving us everything we need." He paused, studying them both. "What are your plans now?" Jake and Margaret exchanged glances. "Haven't quite figured that out yet," Jake admitted. "Well, when you do, let me know. The federal government owes you both a debt. Might be able to help with a fresh start. If you're interested, there's good land opening up in Colorado territory, far from here and Thornton's influence." After Carter left, they sat in comfortable silence. The storm was passing, leaving clean-washed air and the promise of clear skies ahead. Jake thought about his ranch, the solitary life he'd built. It held no appeal now, not compared to the possibility of something new with Margaret. "Colorado," Margaret said thoughtfully. "I've heard it's beautiful there, mountains and meadows, clear streams full of trout. Could build a good life there." Jake agreed. "Ranch some cattle, maybe horses, build a proper house." "With a library," Margaret added, smiling. "And a garden. My mother always had the most beautiful garden. And children," Jake asked softly. "Would you want—" Her smile widened. "Yes, a whole houseful, raised to know right from wrong, to stand up for what matters." She grew serious again. "But Jake, are you sure? After losing Sarah—" "Sarah's gone," Jake said gently. "I'll always carry her memory, but she wouldn't want me to stop living. These past days with you, it's like waking up from a long sleep. You brought me back to life. Margaret," she was crying now, quiet tears sliding down her cheeks. "And you saved mine, in more ways than one." They talked long into the night, making plans, dreaming dreams. The danger wasn't completely past. There would be testimony at further trials, the process of Thornton's appeals, the possibility of revenge from his remaining supporters. But for the first time, they were looking forward instead of back. As dawn broke over Fort Stockton, painting the rain-washed world in shades of gold and rose, Jake and Margaret sat together by the window. His shoulder ached, and exhaustion pulled at them both, but neither wanted to break the spell of this moment. "No regrets?" Jake asked, watching the sun climb higher. "None," Margaret said firmly. "I'd do it all again, even knowing the cost. Some things are worth fighting for. Justice, truth." She looked up at him. "Love." It was the first time either had used the word, but it felt right, natural, like something that had been growing between them since that desperate plea by the river. "I love you too," Jake said simply, Probably have since you aimed my own rifle at those canyon walls and saved our hides. She laughed, the sound bright as morning. A strange courtship, Mr. Sullivan. Gunfights and trials and desperate flights through the desert. But never boring, he pointed out, managing a grin despite his exhaustion. No, she agreed. Never boring. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the storm clouds. In a few hours, they'd need to face the world again. Paperwork and testimonies, arrangements for travel, the 1,000 details of starting a new life. But for now, they sat together in the morning light. Two souls who'd found each other in violence and fear, and discovered something stronger than either. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise. There would be challenges. Jake knew. Thornton's threats might not be empty. The memories of these brutal days would linger. Building a life together would take work, compromise, patience. But as Margaret leaned against his good shoulder, her hand in his, Jake felt nothing but hope. They'd faced the worst and survived. Whatever came next, they'd meet it together. Ready for a new adventure? He asked. Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. With you? Always. And as Fort Stockton woke around them, beginning another day in the endless cycle of frontier life, Jake Sullivan and Margaret Campbell looked toward Colorado and the promise of a life built on truth, courage, and the love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. 6 months had passed since the trial, and the Colorado mountains stood majestic against the autumn sky. Jake Sullivan stood on the porch of the cabin he'd built with his own hands, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The wound in his shoulder had healed, leaving only a scar to remind him of that chaotic day in the Fort Stockton courthouse. "Jake, supper's ready," Margaret called from inside, her voice carrying the warmth that still made his heart skip after all these months. He turned to find her in the doorway, framed by lamplight, wearing a simple calico dress with flour dusting her hands. They'd married 2 weeks after arriving in Colorado, in a small ceremony with Marshal Carter and his wife as witnesses. The federal government had indeed helped them secure land, 160 acres of prime grazing territory with a clear mountain stream running through it. "Smells wonderful," he said, following her inside. Their cabin wasn't large, but it was solid and well built, with a stone fireplace and real glass windows, a luxury Margaret had insisted on. Books lined one wall, the beginning of the library she'd dreamed of. Through the bedroom door, he could see the quilted coverlet her new friends from town had made as a wedding gift. As they sat down to dinner, venison stew and fresh bread, Margaret had that look in her eyes that meant she had news. "Letter came today," she said, producing an envelope from her apron pocket. "From Marshal Carter." Jake tensed slightly. Letters from Texas usually meant updates about Thornton or his remaining supporters. Though most of the gang had been imprisoned or scattered, there were always concerns about revenge. Margaret read aloud. "Dear friends, thought you'd want to know that Charles Thornton died in prison last week. Heart failure, the doctors said, though I suspect it was rage that finally killed him. His lawyers were preparing another appeal, but now that's finished. You can truly rest easy." Jake felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. "It's over then? Really over?" "Yes." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "Though I can't help but feel, not glad exactly, but relieved." Jake supplied. "Nothing wrong with that. Man brought it on himself." They finished dinner in thoughtful silence. Then Jake helped Margaret clear the dishes, something that still amused her. A man doing kitchen work. But Jake had learned that partnership meant sharing all tasks, not just the dangerous ones. Later, they sat by the fire, Margaret reading aloud from one of her books while Jake mended a bridle. It was a scene of such domestic peace that sometimes he could hardly believe it was real. Just a year ago, he'd been a bitter, isolated man, convinced his life held nothing but endless, empty days. A sound outside made them both freeze, horses approaching. Old habits died hard. Jake reached for the rifle above the mantel, then relaxed as he recognized the voices calling hello. "It's the Andersons," Margaret said, peering out the window. "And it looks like Doc Miller's with them." Their neighbors from the valley below had taken to stopping by regularly, bringing news and companionship. Jake opened the door to find Tom Anderson, his wife Mary, and the town doctor dismounting in the yard. "Evening, folks," Tom called. "Sorry to come by so late, but Doc has news we thought you should hear right away." They gathered around the fire, Margaret serving coffee and the apple cake she'd baked that morning. Doc Miller, a kindly man in his 60s, looked unusually serious. "Got a telegram from Fort Worth today," he began. "There's fever broken out down there, typhoid. They're desperate for medical help and supplies." He paused, looking at Margaret. "I remember you mentioning your mother was a nurse, that she taught you." "Yes," Margaret said slowly. "She did. Town council's putting together a relief effort, medicines, blankets, food, but what they really need is folks who know how to tend the sick. I'm too old for such a journey, but I thought, well, it's a lot to ask." Jake saw the conflict in Margaret's eyes. Her mother had died nursing others during a fever outbreak. The memory was painful. But he also saw something else. The same moral courage that had made her flee Thornton rather than be party to murder. "We'll go," Jake said quietly. "Both of us." Margaret looked at him with surprise and gratitude. "Are you sure? The ranch—" "Tom can look after things here," Jake said, glancing at their neighbor, who nodded agreement. "This is important." And so it was decided. 3 days later, they joined a wagon train heading south with supplies. The journey took 2 weeks, and what they found in Fort Worth was heartbreaking. Families devastated, children orphaned, the few doctors overwhelmed. Margaret threw herself into the work with a dedication that awed Jake. She organized the other volunteers, set up a proper sick ward, and spent endless hours tending patients. Jake helped where he could, building additional shelters, distributing supplies, and often simply sitting with the dying so they wouldn't be alone. "Your wife's an angel," an elderly woman told Jake one evening as Margaret moved between beds. "Checking temperatures and distributing medicine. Don't know what we'd have done without her." Jake watched Margaret work, saw the exhaustion in her shoulders but also the purpose in her movements. This was who she was. Someone who couldn't turn away from suffering, who acted on conscience regardless of cost. 6 weeks later, the fever had broken. The crisis was past. As they prepared to return to Colorado, the mayor of Fort Worth insisted on a public ceremony of thanks. Margaret tried to refuse, but the townspeople wouldn't hear of it. "You saved lives," the mayor said simply. "That deserves recognition." Standing beside Margaret as she accepted the town's gratitude, Jake felt a pride deeper than anything he'd known. She'd faced her fears, honored her mother's memory, and made a difference. The scared woman he'd found by the river had become someone remarkable. The journey home was quieter, both of them processing all they'd seen and done. As their wagon climbed back into the Colorado mountains, Margaret finally spoke about it. "I understand now why Mother couldn't turn away," she said softly. "Even knowing the risk. When you can help, when you have the skills and knowledge, how can you not?" "Same reason you couldn't stay quiet about Thornton," Jake observed. "It's who you are." She leaned against him, careful of his shoulder, which still ached in cold weather. "Who we are," she corrected. "You didn't have to come with me. The ranch needed tending, and fever's dangerous. Where you go, I go," Jake said simply. That's what partnership means. As they crested the final ridge and saw their valley spread below, their cabin nestled by the stream with smoke rising from the chimney, Tom Anderson had kept the home fires burning. Margaret gasped softly. "What is it?" Jake asked, concerned. She placed a hand on her stomach, a wondering expression on her face. Jake, I think we're going to have a baby." The reins nearly slipped from Jake's hands. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure. I've been feeling different for weeks now, but with everything happening, She looked up at him anxiously. "Are you happy? Happy?" Jake thought of Sarah, of the children they'd never had, of the years he'd spent convinced that part of his life was over. Now here was Margaret, offering him another chance at everything he'd thought lost. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said roughly, pulling her close. They arrived home to find everything in good order, their neighbors having cared for the ranch as if it were their own. That evening, as they sat once again by their fire, the future seemed to stretch before them full of promise. "Our child will grow up here," Margaret said dreamily, looking around the cabin. "Learn to ride in these meadows, fish in that stream. We'll teach them everything, how to shoot, how to read, how to stand up for what's right, how to help others." Jake added, "Even when it's dangerous or difficult." "Yes," Margaret agreed, "especially then." As the fire burned low, they made their way to bed outside. The first snows of winter were beginning to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white. Come spring, there would be new life in the fields, in the pastures, and in their home. Jake thought back to that day by the Rio Grande when a desperate woman had whispered, "They'll kill me if you don't help." He'd made a choice then that changed everything. Lost his solitude but found love, faced violence but discovered purpose, nearly died but learned truly to live. "No regrets?" Margaret asked sleepily, echoing his thoughts. "Only one," Jake admitted. She turned to look at him, concerned. "What?" "That it took me so long to find you." She smiled, snuggling closer. "We found each other when we needed to. That's what matters." As sleep claimed them, Jake reflected on the strange paths life could take. A year ago, he'd been dead inside, going through the motions of living. Now he had a wife he adored, a child on the way, and a future bright with possibility, all because he'd chosen to help instead of ride away. The snow continued to fall, covering the scars of the past with the promise of tomorrow. In the morning, they'd wake to a world made new, ready to face whatever challenges came their way. Together, they'd build something lasting, a family, a legacy, a life worth living. Charles Thornton was dead, his empire dust, but here in this mountain valley, love had triumphed over hate, courage over fear, and two wounded souls had found healing in each other's arms. It was, Jake thought as he drifted off to sleep, more than he'd ever dared to hope for, and it was only the beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope you've enjoyed following Jake and Margaret's journey from that fateful meeting by the river to their new life in Colorado. Where are you listening to this story? I'd love to know. Please leave a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, romance, and adventure from the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Jake and Margaret's story. What moment touched you most? Your feedback means everything, and I can't wait to hear from you.